Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV. I haven't used my artillery opener for some time, and I like that one. It's noisy and loud and wakes people up. Anyway, we talk about artillery a lot on the channel, but often it's sort of kind of in an abstract way. People just say, and a barrage was opened up at, or they used artillery to push back the enemy. But how is it deployed, used, and controlled? Edward Bowie returns to explain how the US Army Field Artillery brought its immense firepower to bear, how it learned how to do it, etc., etc. I'll bring him in now. Good afternoon, sir. How are you today?
I'm good, Woody. Thank you for having me back. It's good to be here.
Thank you for being here. So, as I said then, we talk about artillery a lot, but we don't always just go back and explain how it works. Rob came on a few months ago and talked a bit about observation and and that sort of aspect, forward observers. And, you know, it comes up occasionally how the casualty rates of the forward observers and things like that. But sometimes it's good to just kind of go back. I'm not going to say going back to basics because you're doing far more than a basic level presentation today, but to go back to just how it actually works and what is supposed to happen. So, and that was your career. You were in the artillery in the US Army, so you have some experience.
I do. Thank you.
Good. Well, I'll bring up the slides, and folks, there's a lot of information on the slides coming up, so I'm going to anticipate that a lot of the questions you're going to ask will be answered as the presentation goes on. That doesn't mean you can't ask them. It just means that I will only put them if I think they will need to be addressing. But if you've got a specific one about something on screen, of course, fire away. But I'm going to hand it over to Bud to take us through this. So over to you, sir. Time on target, US Army Field Artillery.
Thanks, Woody. Yeah, so that's going to be my discussion today. I'm going to try to minimize the technical detail because, you know, maybe you don't know. Other than the medical corps, the artillery school to this day has the longest basic course in the Army. It's longer than the aviation school. There's unfortunately a lot of math. I'm going to try to keep it as simplified as I can, but to make my case, and my thesis, by the way, is in blue there on the title slide, that the U.S. Army Field Artillery was the outstanding combat arm of World War II for the U.S. I would also make the argument, and I'm sure I'm going to get a lot of pushback, and I welcome that too, that the U.S. Army had the best artillery in the Second World War by a long chalk. That's not to take anything away from anyone else's artillery. It's just that the U.S. had approached it differently, had thought through deeply, and then, of course, could avail itself of eventually our enormous economic resources to expand that into a genuinely formidable delivery of firepower. The Russians certainly were capable of delivering formidable firepower, but I will throw this out now. We can come back to it later. The Russians tended to compensate for a lack of competence in gunnery and observation by sheer volume. The U.S. never had to resort to that, and I'll demonstrate why as we go. Yeah. But I want to start and lead off here with an actual fire mission. This is a genuine incident. I have simplified it a little bit for the non-technicians in the crowd, but you know, we'll start out in September in Eastern Lorraine, France. The U.S. 20th Corps, the 5th Infantry Division, the 2nd Battalion, 11th Regimental Combat Team was actually moving from an administrative area to the line of contact, or the line of departure, rather, excuse me, when they were taken under rather heavy fire from a delaying Panzer Grenadier Company of the 17th SS Division in a small village that they had previously undetected their presence. So that became a target of opportunity. The distinction here being that was not pre-planned as part of the preparation for the offensive. It was an unexpected target. The American Forward Observation Party with the right-hand battalion, the 2nd Battalion of the regiment, called for an immediate request to fire to their direct support battalion. That's that arrow going to the DSFDC, to their fire direction center. I'm going to come back and explain what all these things are later on, but the Fire Direction Center immediately detailed the battery specifically assigned in direct support to fire an immediate suppression mission. Immediate suppression means that you want the rounds out now It's mostly to throw the enemy off their stroke, make them duck, throw off their aim. You're not terribly concerned with accuracy. And that battery fired 12 rounds, mixture of white phosphorus and high explosive. But then they had a problem. The problem was that they were moving to the line of departure for an imminent attack. In fact, the Mets offensive. They were committed to the division preparation fires. And to lose a battery from that is a problem. So the battalion, the Direct Support Battalion Fire Direction Center, contacted the Division Fire Direction Center for the 5th Division. Truthfully, the 5th Division Fire Direction Center was already monitoring the fire net. They were aware of the mission. They couldn't provide any support because all of their guns were committed to the preparation. So they contacted the 20th Corps Fire Direction Center. That's the one in white there. Most of their guns were also committed to this prep fire, but they did find one battalion that was not committed to it. That's that GS battalion in sort of pinkish red there. That happened to be an M12 self-propelled gun battalion. And they detailed them to take over this fire mission. That GS battalion directly contacted on the net the fire observation party for the battalion, and then they assumed the mission and ultimately fired 60 rounds of high explosive in a neutralization mission. I'll come back and explain neutralization. It's different than immediate suppression is to throw them off the stroke. Neutralization is you want to do real damage, but mostly what you want to do is paralyze them so that maneuver forces can move against them without incurring the kind of fires they would ordinarily get. It's different than the destruction mission. The U.S. Army very rarely fired a destruction mission because it takes a long time. It eats up a staggering amount of ammunition, and it's generally not necessary. If you can neutralize the enemy, then you can overrun them, and you don't have to waste your time destroying them with artillery fire, if that makes sense. So that self-propelled M12 battalion laid in 60 rounds, and the battalion was able to move over that delaying position to their line of departure very successfully. The significant thing, I think, in this is that the total time of that mission, from the immediate request for fire to the last GS round impacting, was 6 minutes. That would have been impossible in World War I. It was unusual for any other army to pull off anything like that in World War II. In fact, I kind of doubt it was possible even in September from 44 for any of the other Allied nations to do it in that time frame. Remember, this is a mission that got routed from a battalion to the division to the corps to the firing unit, delivered that fire in 6 minutes. What I think is illuminating is that for the U.S. Army in September of 1944, that was a routine mission. That's what we could do. Talk a little bit about, at the risk of insulting your extremely informed viewers, just a reminder of, what artillery is. Artillery isn't just the guns. It's an entire system of subsystems. And what I'm going to argue here is the U.S. had exceptionally good guns. I'll show you some of them anon. But what the U.S. had, in my opinion, and the opinion of a great many historians, was the most exceptional system, the most responsive, the most accurate, the most flexible, and most resilient. And that made us an invaluable member of that combined arms team. They didn't use the term combined arms team so much in World War II. They called it a combat team, but we call it a combined arms team now, and it gives the flavor of the thing. Mm-hmm. The artillery cannot take or hold ground alone. The artillery can't do much alone, not without tremendous cost to themselves in lives and materiel. But they make the lives of the tankers and the infantrymen so much easier. So The origins of this superior system actually lie in the First World War. I covered this last February in a talk I had about the U.S. experience in World War I.
Yep.
And how that equipped us for World War II, intellectually and procedurally and materially, actually. The thing about World War I, it's often called, the Germans still historically call it the artillery war. It was a war where artillery came to the forefront in a way that had never been foreseen before. Everyone's image of World War I is sort of men huddling in trenches against artillery fire. I put up a picture there of what the British bombardment at the Somme did to a single German position around a farmhouse somewhere in Belgium or France, I don't know, wherever the hell the Somme is. Incredible power was demonstrated. Incredible firepower was demonstrated by the artillery, but here was the rub. It was tactically dominant everywhere. It was operationally decisive nowhere. And there are a number of factors for that, or that led to that. I mean, I'll just give everybody a second to glance through this. The really core problem at the end of the day was in bad communications, inadequate communications. They just couldn't talk to each other rapidly enough in real time to make a tactical difference. And they compensated for that in large measure through sheer volumes and duration of fire. And that had, as I noted in the last bullet there, the problem was that also wrecked the ground that you needed to advance over. And that caused more problems than you might believe. I mean, here's a British 18-pounder trying to move forward during the Somme campaign. And that gun is stuck if a British artillery officer is down in the muck with the guys trying to put it out. And that's a metaphor for how the U.S. Army intellectually approached the problem of field artillery after the war. It metaphorically and literally, in many ways, artillery, for all its devastating potential, was sort of stuck in the mud. So 1919, our boys come home, yay. I've covered some of that other places. We were very proud of the job they'd done, but as you know, the war turned out not to be terribly popular in the end. They didn't come home just with the uniforms on their backs. They came home with all the stuff we'd acquired in Europe, and we didn't have well, that's not entirely true. We had a handful of American manufactured guns in France in the Great War, but they were too few to bother mentioning. Almost all our guns, the overwhelming majority of our guns, were procured from France or Britain.
Yeah.
And they were expensive, and we brought them home. 8,500 light guns, almost 6,000 medium guns, almost 5 million rounds of ammunition, especially when the stuff in late production that was too late in production to be canceled was delivered somewhere in 1819. That's a lot of materiel. The problem is we also came back with a professional conviction that what we had wasn't what we wanted. And in another great war, it wasn't going to be adequate. And as a result of the existence of that vast, by American standards, vast stockpile of World War I leftover equipment, that turned out to be something of an albatross in terms of reform and reorganization and reacquisition, because it always seemed to a somewhat penurious Congress it would be better just to take the World War I guns, as I've demonstrated there, and why don't we just modernize them? Why do you need brand new guns? Well, that's what, unfortunately, we did a lot of for a long time. Again, I've spoken before, and I will speak again to anyone that will listen about the intellectual aggressiveness and integrity and foresight of the U.S. professional military and interwar years. Even if we were materially unready, I have said before, and I'll say again, we were intellectually perhaps the best prepared combatant of the war. before the end of 1918, Chief of Staff March had directed the Chief of Artillery, who was William Snow, and a man terribly important to the development of U.S. artillery, to capture the lessons of the war and learn what we need to do it better next time around. In those 5 bullets I have there are the principal lessons of the 3 major boards that met to consider field artillery. 2 of those boards were led by Brigadier General Westervelt, 1 by Brigadier General Hero. They all came to the same conclusions. I don't need to read the slides to everybody, I guess. The most important thing was that we had concluded that the 75 millimeter gun, that particularly the French 1897, the French 75, as the Americans always called it, brilliant gun design, absolutely revolutionary in the 1890s, but had inadequate firepower for the modern battlefield. They were deeply influenced by the German FH-16 that had come out, actually fielded in 1917, 105 millimeter gun, really good range, a lot of flexibility, a little too heavy. They were very impressed by that and had concluded early on that that's really what we needed to standardize on. But with 8,575s in the barns, good luck. They also concluded before we came home in 1919 that horses were not suited to the modern battlefield as a prime mover for an artillery piece. And they were already looking at motorization. There'd been an awful lot of motorization during the war. The problem was trucks in those days had very limited cross-country capabilities. They had all kinds of growing issues, but that needed to be addressed. And we needed a motorized artillery for everything, not just the light guns, everything. And lastly, and this was a problem, the biggest problem, there was a lot of bitterness from the infantry in particular about how long it took artillery fires against an unplanned target to be delivered. So bad, in fact, that during the maneuver phases at the end of 1918, during the 100 days, the infantry took to submitting requests for fire with a time limit of an hour and a half. So that if you can't fire this mission in an hour and a half, don't bother, we'll already be there one way or the other. That was just unacceptable to them. And they began to lose faith in the artillery's ability to support them. And so there was a clear sense in the artillery community and the Army generally that the most important thing to fix in all of this was how fast unplanned fires could be delivered in volume.
And if they're recognizing that in 1919, that is based on experience of how the speed infantry moves to war in 1919, the speed aviation moves in 20 years time, everything is going to be getting to the battlefield much quicker. So
absolutely,
artillery better speed up or lose the fight.
Exactly. And by the way, artillery is fighting this whole time because there is that whole air visionary group. Yeah. By the way, people talk about the bomber mafia in America, but it seized Britain much more heavily in many ways than it did the United States. And it's one of the reasons Britain had an inadequate medium and heavy artillery arm at the beginning of the war, because they had convinced themselves that the bombers would do that stuff and we didn't need heavy artillery. They got disabused of that notion quite quickly. Ended up, first recycling a lot of World War I heavier guns, and then ultimately getting, M1s from the US and whatever, 240 millimeters, whatever. Okay. What was the locus of this innovation? Well, that would have been the U.S. Field Artillery School at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, which, believe me, I've been there. I've spent a lot of time in Fort Sill, and I can't tell you how much I admire the intellectual creativity and the professionalism associated with it. But Lawton, Oklahoma, it's not quite the end of the world, but you can see it from there. Not a great place to live. Any rate, though, this was an incredibly explosive period from the 20s into the mid-30s. And that was largely under the purview of another officer you see in the upper right-hand corner there, Major General Robert Danforth, who is one of those figures whose name really shouldn't have been forgotten, because without him, the U.S. wouldn't have had the artillery it had in the Second World War, and the war might have gone very differently for us had that happened. Danforth, first as commandant of the school, and then laterally as chief of artillery, had the intellectual insight, the technical skill to understand what was going on and what we needed and how to get it. And maybe even more importantly, he ultimately had the political acumen to get it done in an environment where budgets were absurdly small, where the Army didn't have a big voice, etc. So all that equipment, much of that equipment that you see scattered across the bottom of the screen, one way or another, can be related back to Danforth. All of it would become very important to us. He's the guy who got it done. And I just would like to get he's been dead quite a long time, but get a shout out for him anyway, because he deserves it. The artillery came down. This is still a slogan, you can go to Fort Sill now and you'll find basic trainees running in cadence shouting this. What does the artillery do? We shoot, we move, and we communicate. It's as simple as that. That masks a world of technical complexity, but it is as simple as that. Those are your imperatives. And that transformation, starting slowly in the 1920s, gaining big time speed in the mid-30s, and then coming to fruition just in time for delivery in 1942, involved those 4 bullets that I have listed there. Again, at the risk of insulting anybody, but we don't always dive deep into this stuff. All the guns I have up and clustered in the left-hand corner are American. I decided to keep this on an American line. Everybody's playing with this. But just as a reminder, this is what conventional artillery does. There are technical ballistic differences between a mortar, a howitzer, and a field gun, and an anti-aircraft gun. That said, we'll add to the confusion, because both American and British, artillerymen tend to refer to their artillery pieces of whatever specimen as a gun. It's what we say. It is confusing, but I will remind everybody there is a technical distinction between a howitzer and a gun, and it's very important when you're balancing your artillery, for doctrinally for combat. In addition to improved guns that were built during the war, again, based on experiences in World War I, based on improved metallurgy, based on all kinds of technical improvements, as important as the differences in the gun were probably eclipsed by the changes in ammunition. Ammunition, based on a much deeper study of ballistic science that went on during World War I and after, became much more aerodynamically streamlined, much better balanced, much more capable. There was an enormous amount of work in the chemistry involved in propelling charges. You see those in the lower left-hand corner of the upper quadrant. This was a much, much, much more potent family of ammunition for all the combatants going into the Second World War. Okay. That said, this is what fell out of all that work. By the dawn of 1942, in many cases preceding 12 months or so, the U.S. was fielding an entirely new suite, or almost an entirely new suite, of division support pieces. These are the guns that are going to be attached directly to the division. These are the pieces that are going to be most directly involved in immediate infantry or armor support. These are the maneuver guns, if you like. The 2, of course, standouts, the M2 105, which is practically synonymous with World War II artillery. I think it was Steve Zaluga that it was Ian Hogue that said, if you ask an American what an artillery piece is, he's just going to say 105 reflexively, because that's what they did. That was the gun that the infantry was the most familiar with. That was right behind them most of the time. But an even more outstanding gun in many ways is in the lower right-hand corner, that M1 155 millimeter howitzer. That's actually, I think that's the longest serving gun on active duty in the U.S. inventory. I could be wrong. I'm a little biased there too, because when I was a brand new artillery second lieutenant, I was assigned to, and by then we changed the name to M114, but it was the same gun. And in fact, I in the motor pool one day, I looked up my carriage serial number because I was a bored young lieutenant, and that carriage had been poured in 1943. So there you go. And we were still using it in 1983, and it was still a damn fine gun. But most of those pieces became important one way or another. Above them, we had a new suite, an almost new suite of core support pieces. The one in the upper left-hand corner, the French GPF, we'd gotten a bunch of those from the French towards the end of the war. We had a lot in storage. We weren't terribly happy with it. It wasn't a terribly accurate gun. It ended up being the main tube on an M12 howitzer, and I'll talk the self-propelled howitzer. I'll talk about that later on. But otherwise, it mostly served the war in coastal artillery defense capacity, and it was a good gun for that. Again, the outstanding one, the one that, again, most people know would be the long tom there, the M1A1 gun. That is distinct from a howitzer, much longer range, this was a quantum leap forward when it was first fielded in 1938. The carriage, the balance, its general performance characteristics were enormously superior. It didn't shoot quite as far, not quite as far as the German 170, which we learned to hate because of its range. But in every other dimension, it was a vastly superior piece. And then at the very bottom, the heaviest hitters. You don't hear much about them because they still had to, they are such enormous guns. Their emplacement times are still they had to be moved in multiple loads. Their emplacement times are still measured in hours, but there were times when they became very important. A gun that is unfairly forgotten, but it's also had enormous longevities in the upper right-hand corner, the 8-inch, which is 203 millimeter. That's a carryover from the 19th century. I don't know why. We still set it up in my day. That was a remarkable piece, both because of how hard it hit, but turned out, for fluky reasons that weren't necessarily part of the design concept, that was the most accurate gun in the Army, and it was prized for that. I mean, it had a staggeringly accurate fire. Accuracy of an artillery piece is measured in the circular area of probable. You may have heard that term before. It's usually a multiple of the bursting radius of the charge. The circular error the bursting radius on an 8-inch charge is almost 100 yards. I'm going to stay in yards. We used meters. We started using meters even during World War II, but I'm going to stay with yards because that was the more common. The lethal radius of an 8-inch round is almost 100 yards. It's like 85 yards. The circular error probable was 20 yards at 10,000 meters or 10,000 yards. That's remarkably accurate gun. So it was extremely useful, especially as a counter battery weapon. The U.S. Army had thought very hard about self-propelled artillery, actually much harder than the German Army thought about it, interestingly enough. The Germans knew they wanted one. Then for whatever complex reason, they never really got around to doing much about it until the war had actually started. This is not true of the U.S. Army. They had been thinking about it early on. Getting the money to do it was pretty tough. But, during the war, above the little red crooked line I have there are the weapons that we actually fielded during the war in significant numbers. I think everybody knows the M7 became an enormously important piece for us, highly successful weapon. The T-19 was not. Strange weapon because it was fielded in significant numbers, but it never got an M designation because we were never happy with it. The truth was the M3 half-track was just an unstable gun platform. The 105 was just too much gun on it. On the M7, it worked fine. I include the ones at the bottom, though, because all of those are war designs. All but the M37 actually got a few shots in at the end of the war. They all would go, but they would all go on to be very important Cold War guns and served well into the late 20th century, and in a couple of cases, the 21st. But more important than our guns, because our guns were good, but everybody's guns were fairly good. I mean, you know, every army has a testing process. A gun that's a complete failure is rarely going to actually get fielded. More important to that probably was our fleet of prime movers. You'll notice that you don't see any animals on this page. The German army couldn't say that. You know, the vast majority of the German army's division guns right into 1945 were moved by horseflesh. We didn't want to do that from Jump Street, and we never, well, with one exception I'll show you in a minute, we never had to. You know, starting with this new generation, which the Army was involved in promoting the development and the design of, you know, of these highly cross-country capable heavy lift trucks, and for the various heavy guns tracks. And below the blue line there, you know, joined starting in fairly early in 43, but really by the end of 43, a whole new generation of tracked high-speed tractors, as we call them. This was all kind of inspired by the success of the Holt tractor back in 1917.
And just my British perspective, looking at that slide there, Bud, I'm thinking of the 25-pounder tow behind the Morris quad. It's a great vehicle, but it was just about capable of the job. It didn't have extra power to spare. When I look at the Diamond T and things like that, you seem to be giving more power than you need to tow the gun. It could do it, and it could do some to spare. The British, by necessity, we ended up having vehicles that would just do the job, but couldn't. I mean, I literally owned a Morris C8, which is the same engine, the same vehicle type as the Morris quad. And it wasn't good without a gun towed behind it. With a gun behind, I mean, it did the job. I'm not criticizing the British artillery for doing it, but it just you went for it. You went for it, and you went for it. And you know, as I say, the Germans were horse-drawn, British were in the middle somewhere. Just that slide there, the amount of torque, the amount of horsepower you're putting in front of a gun.
And, you know, in fairness, the professional German army had intended to fully motorize. The war came too soon for them to get that done. They had some outstandingly good vehicles, you know, the whole series of SDK half tracks. But they could never produce them in sufficient numbers, with the result that, you know, the overwhelming majority of the German divisions were still using horse teams, like I said, into 45.
Yeah, absolutely.
So what's that give? That gave the U.S. an almost unprecedented degree of mobility over virtually any terrain. I said there was one exception to the horseflesh issue, and it wasn't really horseflesh, it was more mule flesh. The U.S. Army discovered, rather to its surprise and just in time, that in a surprisingly large number of cases, we actually still needed mules. Mountains, jungles, which we encountered in greater frequency than perhaps we thought about prior to the war. And so we were lucky we found out when we did, because we hadn't destroyed all the harness and et cetera that was still stored somewhere, and they could drag it back out and get the mules rolling again. It turned out to be very important in North Africa, turned out to be critically important in Italy, and it turned out to be fairly important in a surprisingly large number of Pacific campaigns. So it was really kind of nice that that little 75 pack howitzer, which had primarily been conceived for mountain warfare, then improved for airborne warfare. It was lucky, and it was a great little gun. I'll talk about that a little bit more later, but a remarkably high-performing little gun. It was nice that it could be broken down into mule loads, because we needed that. But that was still a tertiary role for the Army. What you got in the middle there with that M4 tractor, you know, hauling along an M1 gun, that was the heart of the Army at that point. Lest we forget, and the U.S. field artillery certainly never did. They stayed involved in the development of all kinds of other branches' equipment, because they recognized that, you know, a gun is a gun. There are, I have pissed off some good friends who are armor officers, but you know, at the end of the day, what is a tank? It's a platform for an artillery piece. You know, the infantry, based on their diminished faith in field artillery's capacity to support them quickly, insisted on having their own infantry guns. Most of the combatants did. Even the British flirted with one. They never fielded it, but they put a lot of work into one. The thing is, all of these weapons were capable of indirect fire, and to at least a basic degree, they had the equipment to do it, and they had the training to do it. Now, was their training terribly current? Not really, but professional field artillery officers, knowing they had the equipment, in many cases could go down and sort out the complexities of indirect fire and help them do it. Turned out in many occasions that all that additional fire support was terribly important. And I'll show you some examples coming up. Now I'm going to have to drop in, again, to make my case here, to try to validate my thesis. I'm going to have to talk a little about an indirect fire system. And if you really don't want to go into the details of alternate interior angles and trigonometry, this would be an excellent time to hit the bathroom. I'll still be talking when you get back. You know, those are the four big challenges there that you've got to overcome. And they had to overcome, well, they even overcame them before World War I in some cases, but this is what really came to the fore in World War I. It's like, how do you hit what you can't see? In an artillery that for 200 years had been used to pulling up next to the infantry and unlimbering their horses and blaring away. Here's your first and biggest problem: angular deviation. And I've characterized what I think of her up in red. Over range, and we're talking real range now, at 8,000 yards, if you are off by as little as 0.03 degrees, and I don't know how good you are with a compass, Woody, but most people can't get inside 0.03 degrees with a basic magnetic compass. You're at 8,000 yards, you're going to miss your target by 300. Which is way outside the bursting radius of anything. I bring this up for a different point. Various armies, most conspicuously the British, and I say most conspicuously the British because when you say the British, now we're also talking Canadians, Australians, New Zealanders. They decided to stick with the compass degree system. Okay. On paper, mathematically, there are 360 degrees in a circle, and there are 60 minutes in every degree, which gives you 21,900 degree, increments. But as a practical matter, in terms of field instrumentation, what the average person can actually do in a reasonable period of time cannot be that accurate. So the French during World War I, who enormously influenced the Americans because the overwhelming majority of our artillery training came from the French, had gone to a system called milliradians. We call it mils for short. We still use it. There are 360 degrees in a circle. There are 6,400 mils in a circle. A mil is dramatically more precise than a whole degree, but it is also manageable in a field instrument quickly. And I bring that up because I have enormous respect for the British artillery. I'll come back to why I do. But this was, I think, a mistake they made because it cost them substantially in accuracy throughout the war. In fact, for whatever reason, then I have no idea. I've never looked into British bureaucratic military history. The British got dragged kicking and screaming into mills in 1955 when NATO standardized procedures. They didn't want to do it then. Partially, it was the investment in equipment because they had to scrap all their stuff and get all this stuff in mills. I get that too. That's expensive. But that's my point. The U.S. field artillery using mills was just that scunch more accurate that often gave them an edge in terms of speed and precision. Fire control. This is a complex looking chart I have here. I don't mean it to be, but you have to remember the guns not only have to shoot and hit their target, they have to shoot together in a battery. They've got to be exactly, within reasonable measure, exactly parallel to each other when they shoot. So the U.S. took a slightly different approach than the British. The British certainly saw the merit in this. Again, it came down to capacity and manpower. But ideally, you want to do this from a surveyed point. There is a way to do hasty military field survey, but it's somewhat manpower intensive, and it's certainly another thing you've got to do. There's built into British guns or American guns, there's a thing called the panoramic telescopic deflection sight, PANTEL for short. What that does is either against a geographical terrain feature, which the British preferred, again, introduces inaccuracy, but the Americans preferred using a naming circle. The British had a naming circle. You could do it. It takes a little bit longer, but what you do is you'll note the line of aim there in blue. The line of aim is usually to the rear of the piece, which seems counterintuitive, but remember, you're laying these guns mathematically, not like you lay a direct tank sight. Ideally, you'll have that point surveyed. If you don't have it, if you can't have it surveyed, there are other ways to get it more accurate. Now, the British were capable of doing this, and they sometimes did. The Americans did it routinely by preference, but we were also capable of doing it the British way if we needed to. You can even do it by stars if you have to. I've done that myself. But what all this does is get the guns precisely located and precisely parallel, and now you can get some business done. Because everything you're going to tell the guns to do later has got to come down to the commands I have at the bottom there in red. The guns, if you start talking the way a forward observer talks, that means nothing to the guns. The only language that the technical gunners, the guys who are actually laying the piece, understand is what projectile you want, what fuse you want, what charge you want behind it, the deflection, and the deflections are left and right of the baseline of fire. If you're British out there, they called that the zero line. Yep. Sometimes difference in nomenclature throws us off a little bit. The deflection left or right of the baseline of fire and the elevation that you want. That's what the guns can understand. That's what they can do. That's what everything's got to be converted to. Now I'm going to talk a little bit more about the Royal Artillery because it's a difference in approach to what the Americans did. And the Royal Artillery in this regard was no different than any other combatant except the United States at the very beginning of the war. They had established what they called observation command posts. Usually that was the battery commander himself. I'm not going to go into detail on it, but you may know that the British, primarily in an attempt to save overhead that may have been misguided, had gone to a rather eccentric system of a battery being divided into two troops, which were essentially little batteries. Theoretically, that would save overhead. The troop commanders would go up and establish a forward observation post. The British made provision later in the war for separate forward observer posts. But at the beginning of the war, and the Germans did this right through the war, that observation post was truly the command post. They not only, and by the way, I'll say this is the picture of a Canadian command OP in Italy. I think this is in late 43. Well, based on their uniforms, late summer 43, something like that. By the way, a better equipped observation post than I've ever been in, so I envy them that. The commander expected to do his own math for the firing solution. So from that observation post, he would do all the determinants to translate the target into a language that the guns could understand, and then issued a fire order that told them the number of rounds, the elevation, deflection, charge, everything from the forward observation post. See some issues with that? Remember, rule of thumb, if you can see them, they can see you.
Yeah.
And if they come under fire, the guns are effectively neutralized, if that makes sense. British, recognizing this as a problem themselves, fairly early in the war, started modifying this to a large extent. And I admire the flexibility of the Royal Artillery. I absolutely do. What they had started doing, even by El Alamein, was they moved up, increased the number of forward observation posts, but they also divided the effort a bit between the battery commander or the commanding observer, because the observers command the British artillery, to what they called the battery post, the command post for the guns themselves. And they could take off a lot of the computation load from the commander by doing it there. That also gives you a much higher ability to double check your numbers. And we always double check our numbers because it really pisses off the does when you drop rounds on them and they're your own rounds. That was a big improvement. It meant that the observer had to do less, although almost to the end of the war, they changed it a little bit towards the very end. The battery commander or the command post was still, the observation post was still determining the range, the azimuth, and the elevation, which was just a level of complexity that the US eliminated in our observers. Another quick note, adjusted fire. There's what works on paper, there's what works in real life. Should hit does not equal did hit. Your mathematical solution is likely to be off for a number of reasons that I've enumerated here. You know, remember that angular deviation problem. Tiny little errors translate into great big misses. You also got the problem of guns are not identical if they came from the same factory on the same day. They have uneven bore wear. They'll have slightly different muzzle velocities. They'll have eccentricities in their recoil and equilibration systems, blah, blah, blah. And then there's the external ballistics. Weather changes trajectories dramatically, especially powder temperature. And that can vary in the length of a gun line, depending on whose powder's in the sun and who's not. But it also matters in terms of crosswinds at different altitudes. Remember, many artillery pieces fire quite high. I mean, you're talking 12, 15,000 feet, you know, at the height of an apex of a trajectory. All this was dealt with in the First World War. There are solutions to it. But I'll get back to those solutions. The simpler solution is throw one out there, see where it lands, and then move it. That's called adjusted fire. You know, you throw one out, boom, there it goes. I'm going to sense it. That's the word that there's a rare example of where the Americans and the British used the same nomenclature. The observer senses that as, you know, 175 long on the gun target line and 350 meters, you can see the math yourself. By the way, how do we determine that, in case you're curious? Built into the optics, either the binoculars or the battery commander's telescope, which is a much superior instrument. You know, you have these stadia that if you know what you're doing, you kind of adjust the numbers for what range you're looking at, and that gives you a much more accurate idea of where the guns land. Now, ideally, what you want to do is get one short, second one I've got up there, one long, one short, and then zoom in. The truth was, in combat, most artilleries, the US and the British, the real standard was, you know, one round and adjustment, get near the target with the second round. But in theory, you want to do both. Once you get close, which is to say within the bursting radius of the kind of shell you have, then you go into fire for effect, and the whole battery fires at that point. And I think everybody's familiar with that term. That's what fire for effect means. The whole battery opens up. Here's problems with using adjusted fire. You know, the enemy notices. If you're going to adjust individual batteries to try to mask the fire of, say, a whole battalion, worse if it's a brigade, then you've got a problem of, do you know whose round that was you're looking at? You know, I think that becomes fairly self-explanatory. Now, there are procedural ways around that. You know, individual batteries talking to a specific guy. Well, there's a command when they shoot, because there's a time of flight variation that can be measured anywhere from 20 seconds to a minute and 20 seconds. You know, you usually say we've shot over, and then you try to give him a heads up about 10 seconds before we think it's going to impact so that he can be paying attention. But if you can imagine multiple batteries firing in a fairly small area, it still gets very confusing. The great advantage of this, as I introed with, is speed. You can get the first round out there in under a minute and a half, 2 minutes, 3 minutes, depends how good you are. And ballistically, these are comparatively simple computations. In fact, as in this example, so simple that even Bolsheviks can do it. There is a better way. Well, there's a more accurate way. The predicted fire system, actually developed in parallel by the British, the French, especially the British, and the Germans during World War I. You know, and this would be the great secret for the Ludendorff offensives, because the Germans use it at scale first, where you're firing predicted fires with a surprisingly high degree of accuracy without adjustment, so you don't lose your operational surprise. But these are the requirements, and I'm not going to list them all out here, but you can see they're fairly burdensome unless you're well prepared for it. There is a hell of a lot of math involved in this. Okay, I went to the basic field artillery gunnery's officers course in 1980, and I still have PTSD about it. You know, differential equations just don't come that easily to a lot of people. But that's what you've got to do. And there's an awful lot of math. With the result that this was the approach most armies took going into the war. That predicted fires are fine for pre-planned targets. You're working a fire plan hours or days before the actual program is going to be fired. You have time to do all this and double check your work. But for a target of opportunity, something you didn't expect, it's just too hard. And this is in green at the bottom, what the artillery school said to itself, starting in 1933, under a really remarkable guy named Carlos Brewer. Is it really? I think there's a way we could do this. And this was perhaps the most important functional change that the U.S. field artillery implemented prior to the war. Under Brewer, they worked out both equipment in the lower right-hand corner. What you see there is a graphical fire table. It's a kind of slide rule. It takes all of the tabular data that has to be extracted and interpolated from a big book of firing tables, which you see on the left there, and puts it on a single board so that you can slide back and forth. And if you know how to work this thing, you can come up with your answer in a couple of less than a minute. If you have to extract it from the firing tables, it could take 3 or 4 minutes, not to mention the interpolation problem. They worked out better firing plots. And the important thing about the firing plot, that's the upper left-hand corner. The important thing about a firing plot is you can theoretically put as many artillery batteries on that one plot as you want. And the cool thing is they don't have to adjust individually. They can all figure out their data to a target. And even if the one gun from one battery firing misses, when they can follow the adjustment, make the correction with all the mathematical corrections to their own position. And when you go into effect, they can all fire together. You don't need to adjust each individual battery.
And I'm thinking that there's also a consistency about the math, in that, as we talked before going live, this math is the same now as it was 100 years ago, as it was 200 years ago. I mean, the basic principles of doing these calculations and trigonometry are the same. Whereas if we're thinking about, I don't know, thinking about tank on tank action, and you think about whether an armor piercing round is going to deflect off the enemy armor, what speed is it moving, there's crazy amounts of variations. I'm assuming that there's a certain
the corrections. You're right about. Well, you're not entirely right about that.
I'm never entirely right.
That, you know,
my wife reminds me I'm never
right. They learned
anything.
a lot more about ballistics as a result of the First World War, and converted it into a much deeper science than it had been before. They learned a heck of a lot more about what we call non-standard variables. I don't want to get too deep in the weeds there, because I'm still trying to forget my nightmares of doing differential calculus 40 years ago. The difference is that what the gunners learn in a tank is their corrections are built into their optics. And if they know how to work their equipment correctly, it's done for them.
Right.
Until the advent of digital computers for the artillery, this still had to be done by longhand math. What Brewer did was he figured out the shortcuts to make that go much faster, starting with the graphical fire table. But there's more things you can do than that. You know, we're bearing in mind that used to be 1 or 2 officers on a hill trying to do all this math themselves on scratch paper. Well, you know what? The guy who's calculating the quadrant, the elevation the gun's going to fire at, can be doing that in parallel with the guy figuring out deflection, because it's a different problem. You don't need the same guy to do both. And that's another thing Brewer did. He broke it up into increments so that they're all doing it at once. By the way, there's 2 working on every problem, so you get an instant safety check. They agree with each other, not to mention the supervision of the fire direction chief computer. In this particular picture, the guy, the staff sergeant leaning against the wall back there, kind of running his own numbers to double check, make sure his guys are straight. This was an enormous improvement in how we approached gunnery. And what we could do in 5 minutes would take the British 20. It would take the Germans an hour and a half. Does that make sense?
Yep, got it. Yep.
Okay. The other guy on there, Orlando Ward, you know, maybe some of you know him from his command.
He came up at the beginning of the sidebar. People said, is he going to come up in the conversation? And that was Eric, by the way. I wanted to put Eric's comment up because it's referencing his, as a fellow double graduate of the U.S. Army Field Artillery School, also known as Comanche County Cannon Corkers College. I can say Bud is doing an outstanding job. So you've got a fellow long range sniper, as we call it in the British Army, in the sidebar there. So good for that.
That's nice to hear. I bounced this off a few of my old colleagues, but I am almost 50 years from gunnery school, so I'm probably screwing up a lot. In any event. I want to stay on Brewer one last note, because what a remarkable guy. And I know a lot of people like stories. Brewer did most of this work between 1934 and 1936. First under the auspices of Jacob Devers. You know, you'll know him from 6th Army Group later on. Devers would turn out to be very important. And then later under Ward, when he took over as chief of the gunnery department, Brewer was top of his class at the Staff College, was top of his class at the War College, was given command in 1942 of the 12th Armored Division. It was assessed as the highest scoring in, the readiness test to decide if a unit was ready to deploy. It was the highest scoring unit in the entire history of the Army Training Command at the time. And then Brewer was informed that there was a new personnel policy. Brewer was 53 years old, that UCOM, the United States Army Europe Command, had decided no division commander could be over 50 when he deployed. Broke Brewer's heart. He tried to pull some strings. He couldn't get anybody to budget. And you know what he did? As a major general, he asked to be reduced to his permanent rank of full colonel, because that rule did not apply to them, and then contacted his old mentor, friend, and superior Devers and said, I missed the First World War because I was a mathematics instructor at West Point. I don't want to miss this one. And he deployed as a colonel to command a heavy artillery group in 6th Army and got there before the end of the war. So good for him. Good guy. At any rate, Orlando Ward then takes over. Orlando Ward's idea is, if we can do all this math this quickly, why do we have to throw this on the shoulders of each individual battery commander at all? And what Ward comes up with, these are always teams of people. What Ward oversaw was the creation of the Fire Direction Center. And this was, in my opinion, the real key, and it's still the key, but it was in World War II, it was the real key to why the U.S. Army was superior to every other artillery. What you've got Centralized control in artillery is always ideal because you can bring far more fire to bear. Yes? Fire Direction Center can do that with far less confusion than other attempts to do that. This is one artillery battalion, one each. Included in it is the Fire Direction Center. It has a computation team for each of its field batteries. Now, the batteries are capable of doing their own computation in an emergency, but if they don't have to, they don't have to. And these three computation teams for A, B, and C batteries are under the supervision of a fire direction officer. In a battalion, that was usually a captain, occasionally a major, but that was earlier in the war before everybody started getting killed. Towards the end of the war, could sometimes even be a first lieutenant. But he is the man. He will decide based on the guidance from his commander and the tactical situation, he will decide the allocation of fires, who gets priority, when we mass, when we don't. He controls at least 3 firing batteries. Sometimes he controls more, and I'll explain that later on. Also associated with that battalion are 3 field observation parties, ground observation parties. I'll talk about them more in a minute. And uniquely to the U.S., at first, the British will catch on to this real quick and do it their own way, but they'll do something similar, is this idea of integral, organic to each field artillery battalion are 2 air observation aircraft and their pilots, who are first and foremost trained artillery observers. They're not just told, hey, while you're out there. And tying all this together, and the thing that really made it possible was FM radios. Communications are the key to all of this. Sorry, I'm turning my phone off here because I didn't realize I'd left it on.
It's just someone telling you're on YouTube, probably.
Yeah, exactly. You're doing a great job, bud. Guy up in the left picture in the upper right quadrant, Roger B. Colton. Another name that people don't remember, and that's a tragedy, because Colton, in the mid 1930s, as chief of the electronics lab for the Signal Corps. I mean, he is kind of a nebbishy looking guy, which is too bad because he was a real soldier. Okay. He's looking at experiments with FM radio and flashes onto the fact that if they can get this working, that's a vastly superior system. Both the Germans and the British were using some variation throughout the war on either VHF radios or UHF radios, AM band radios. Those of us who are old enough to remember when that was typical in a car will remember what a flawed instrument AM radio can be. Yep. You know, every little thunderstorm that comes by, you can't hear the radio anymore. It's much, much more prone to interception.
So I listened to Radio Luxembourg under my covers as a teenager. It was different every bloody night. It was.
Right. Well,
constantly
you know what?
Readjusting.
And that demonstrates the great advantage to AM radio is its range, but that's offset by the degradation in the quality of the sound, the interference, and especially its vulnerability to interception. So Colton works hard with companies that are working on FM radios, and those companies, and I'm blanking on the names right now. The guy who held the patents, and I really should remember his name, for FM radio, was generous enough that he gave them to the United States Army for free for the duration of the war. You don't owe me a dime. That's patriotism. Colton was the one who made sure the Army started converting to radios. And I got Jacob Devers up there on the right. When he was at the artillery school, he was instrumental in saying, we're going straight FM radio, and these are the FM radio bands I want for our purposes, blah, blah, blah. Ends up with this whole suite of equipment. I don't think you're going to find a competent and reasonable historian who would ever argue that the U.S. had the best communication system in the Second World War, because we simply did. We had the most equipment. Our nets were redundant. Now, field telephones were still there. In fact, field telephones by preference, because they can't be intercepted. Pyrotechnics still had a role. Believe it or not, we still made our signal guys learn wigwag right up until, semaphore during the war, although I've never found a case where anybody ever used it, but you never know. But the heart and soul of this whole thing is that tactical FM radio. That leads to a very significant difference, the U.S. Forward Observation Party. Its organization is there. Most of you have heard about it. Ideally, it had a vehicle. The reality of war was often it didn't. Sometimes even if they had one, if they were walking forward with the infantry, they did what they had to do. But what an FO post does is it requests fire from the FDC, and the FDC either grants that or doesn't. They do not issue orders to the battery. They are usually a lieutenant. They're almost always a lieutenant. And they have a very simplified task, which is nice because they can concentrate on trying to stay alive, which can get interesting in the front, as you know. They only have to issue a target description, a detailed target direction. That's critical, or location. That's critical. It can be done a number of ways, but the location is critical. And then any special requests they have based on the type of target, whatever. OP selection for everybody is all about location, just like modern real estate. Sometimes, as in the Marine Party in the middle there. By the way, a quick note on that: there is no structural significant difference between a Marine Marine artillery and U.S. Army artillery. The Marines trained their artillerymen at SIL. They used exactly the same doctrine. They used exactly the same equipment. They may have had USMC on their collar, but there was no structural difference whatsoever. Okay. So we can put that to bed. Altitude is your friend. The higher you are, the better you can see, the better you can adjust if you need to fire. You can assess the effects of fire, etc. Well, what's the ultimate altitude advantage? And of course, this is from World War I too. 800 feet straight up. You're not going to get better than that. So the U.S. artillery was deeply interested in, the Army Air Corps, much laterally, the Army Air Forces, attempts at refining observation equipment. This is in 1940 what Hap Arnold and the Air Force offered. The O-47B. It seemed to them, the ultimate solution of new monocoque, all-metal aircraft. Below is what the U.S. field artillery, based on experiments it had done on their own dime by artillery officers who happened to have a private pilot's license, and working with the Piper Company of light aircraft, wanted the series of L3, 4, 5. They go on. The Air Force laughed. They were like, "No, we're not buying this kite." The artillery insisted. They insisted on two things. They insisted, A, they get the aircraft they want because they assessed that the O-47 was a disaster. By the way, the Air Force eventually would have to admit themselves that it was a disaster. It was reduced to towing targets by 1942. The Air Force didn't think the L4s could survive, or the L3s. They were wrong. It turned out these guys were trained by the nature of their job to do extraordinarily effective nap of the earth flying. It also turned out, who knew? For a high performance fighter, these were really hard to hit. They moved too slow. They could maneuver too fast. They could go too low and hug a hillside. We can't hit them. The guy who really shepherded that through was a colonel named Chandler. Again, forgotten name, very important guy. Not a flyer himself, but understood. And he got the Secretary of War for Air and the Secretary of War on his side, who basically told the Air Force that they were going to buy these for the Army. Get over it. He had an advantage. Both the Secretary for Air and the Secretary of War had been artillery officers in World War I. They understood the problem. What was key here, though, was we were taking artillery officers who understood the business and teaching them to fly, and not flyers and trying to teach them a smattering of artillery. That made all the difference in the world. Guess what we got now? A radically new organization, even different than World War I. These are organic to the artillery. They're air observation posts. The British pick up on this in a New York minute. They do it their own way. Their aircraft and their pilots come from the RAF, their support squadrons. They had actually started the war with the same idea, except they tried to use the Lysander, and that proved as disastrous as the O-47. They quickly flashed on to the fact that the Americans were using Pipers, and they started using Taylorcraft. The Austin, that happens to be a picture of an Austin, actually. The difference is technical and irrelevant.
Yeah.
But it gave an astonishing ability for observation. It gave an astonishing responsiveness in terms of feeding back in real time, the location of fleeting targets. It turned out to be one of the single best intelligence tools of the whole war. In fact, that became a huge problem for the artillery because they became so in demand that general officers were bleeding off artillery spotter aircraft to do their own reconnaissances, their own liaison work, and ultimately, again, rather to Hap Arnold's annoyance, they had to create whole squadrons of separate liaison aircraft so that the artillery could have their aircraft back. But these things, proved to be incredibly durable in the field, incredibly easy to maintain, and capable of flying in weathers that grounded higher performance aircraft. I mean, they flew through much of the bulge every day. Only in the very worst storms were they ever grounded.
Even Henry Fonda in the terrible movie. Yeah.
Right, exactly. In the back seat, at least. So that was good.
Yeah.
All right. So here's a U.S. artillery battalion in late 1941. And it'll stay essentially the same through the war.
And great stuff, by the way. We're absolutely loving it. We're hanging off every word. And you're answering.
I'm not actually watching the sidebar. I find it too distracting.
No, that's my job. It's good.
Thanks. Yeah, you do a phenomenal. I don't know how you do it. I'm very impressed by watching you do that. Here's the real point of this slide. The service battery was an organization somewhat unique to the U.S. field artillery. And it gave each individual field artillery a self-sufficient ability to sustain itself that in turn gave each of them a modularity that was not possible in most other armies' artilleries. You could plug and play U.S. artillery battalions because they could largely take care of themselves in a way that no other army could plug and play as effectively, efficiently, and quickly their own artillery battalions because they were largely self-sufficient. Which is why, I'm going to get into that in a bit, but you get into these stories of artillery, individual artillery battalions being, cross-attached across entire corps, and they just get themselves there and sort themselves out, and they're firing right away. You don't find that in Germany. You do not. Okay?
Yep.
That's where the resiliency piece comes in. The U.S. Army field artillery could largely support itself. It got enormous help from the Ordnance Corps, but it helped itself by having its own liaison, that they ate the billets for the liaisons to the Ordnance Corps to do what they needed to do. And at the rate we were firing, as example, the upper right-hand corner, we're wearing out equipment pretty fast. Barrels have to be changed pretty quickly. Well, the German solution to that is to send the damn gun back to the factory half the time. There's a much better way to do it in the field if you have the right equipment and the people who know how to do it. The artillery have their own artillery mechanics with them. They've got their own automotive mechanics. And the other element in all of this, and this is an advantage of the sheer scale of the U.S. logistics ability, the sheer volumes of ammunition they were firing were really hard for the Axis to even imagine. Where are they coming up with all this?
And the Soviets, we did that wonderful show a few years ago with Sashto about when he talked about the bandwidth of Soviet artillery. They have the tubes, they don't have the stuff, they don't have the, and then everything's wearing out, barrel wear, everything, etc. And it's the volume of what the US can bring to bear.
Exactly.
Halfway through the war and beyond is still staggering.
Absolutely, and I'll come back to that in a minute, but. Now we'll move up. This is all, again, organizations worked out at the field artillery school that that excelled in the actual furnace of battle with minimum modifications. Remarkable accomplishment, I think. Division artillery, they're independent in survey. You don't need to go to the engineers to do it. We'll do our own surveying, so we can do it fast. We can do it hasty. We can do it our way. Their own meteorological section, so you don't have to go to the Air Corps to worry about that. We do our own meteorology. There is a fire direction center at division. It doesn't do technical firing data, although it's capable of a minimum amount of that if it has to. It usually does enough technical stuff to know who's in range reasonably. Mostly what it does, though, it gives you a tactical fires headquarter, again, that can step in and decide priorities, that can mass fires where they're needed, that can move units when they're needed. Critically important stuff. I'm not going to go into the great breakdown below. I think everybody probably is familiar with that. There are it's based on, again, on the triangular division.
Yep.
Each regiment gets their own theoretical battalion, although they can be used. Key thing maybe is at the bottom. Rarely, it did happen. Rarely in World War II was a division artillery reduced purely to its own organic artillery. It usually had one and sometimes many reinforcing units attached. And those came, of course, from the Corps artillery. And again, I've read a lot of authors who kind of say, well, that's the same as an AGRA. Okay, first I'd make a correction and say the AGRA was based on U.S. Corps artillery, but I'm quibbling. Secondly, it's not an AGRA. It's a radically different approach to the problem. You notice that there's no fixed establishment. What they do is, and again, based on experience in World War I, we have groupments of guns. They're interchangeable. They can come and go. Only the headquarters stay the same. Those headquarters are tactical, not technical. They usually have mixed assortment of guns. They can divvy up and reorganize and plug and play as they need to match the commander's assessment, artillery or maneuver of any given situation. It gives the U.S. Army artillery a degree of flexibility in supporting its ground forces that is simply unparalleled. The British do a damn fine job, but they still come second to the U.S. in that regard. Here's a simple way to mass fires. I told you that I was going to put Operation Varsity up there. That's at the bottom. That is a very simple way to mass fires. It's the way the Russians did it by preference because, frankly, they didn't generally have the technical skill to mass fires electronically. It's a lot easier just to go hub to hub and just smother an area with fire. It's why they loved rockets so much. It's why the Germans loved rockets so much. There's a better way. And the better way is to do it on the phone. All of this technical stuff I've explained gave the U.S. Army the capability of, without having to necessarily move its guns, as long as they were in range, we could work a fire plan that could bring everybody together on a single target, and we could do this in 15 to 20 minutes. It would have taken the Germans 3 or 4 hours. It would have taken the British an hour. We could do it with a speed and an agility simply unmatched from a single observation post. If you can get Corps artillery into it, you can hit them that much harder, and we usually could. And we also developed a skill from this that was actually unique during the war and much admired, the time on target mission. I have recently, because I was prepping for this, read various authors that sort of, in fact, I read one very arrogant officer, frankly, frankly, sort of as a definitional on the glossary page of his book, listed a time on target as the American version of a stonk. The British, when they would get a big concentration, call it a stonk. I can't tell you how violently insulting I find that. But more importantly, it is not a version of a stonk. A stonk is just a very heavy concentration. I admire the British ability to do that a lot, but it's not the same thing. What a time on target does, remember, each of these battalions has their own ability. You pick a target, preferably a stationary target, that you think is going to still be there in a reasonable period of time, then the controlling tactical headquarters tells everybody to lay on it and report their times of flight. Based on that time, the time it'll take their projectiles to impact the target. Based on that calculation, they will start a countdown, and everyone will fire at the time they need on that countdown so that as many shells as possible land at once without warning. U.S. Army, another reason we don't particularly like adjusted fire missions, although you often have to do them, is that for every round you fire an adjustment, we reckoned it reduced the impact on the target by 40%. If they all land at once, you catch them cold and you can seriously do some execution. And we could do that repeatedly. That's an awesome amount of power to put in the hands of a young lieutenant, as you can tell from the self-satisfied smirk on the face of this anonymous, but to his family, young lieutenant circa 1983. Sorry, just a little self-advertisement. I also like to remember what I looked like when I was pretty. All right, let's smell a little cordite. I've given you the system. Let's talk about its functioning. Let's first talk about its dysfunctioning. The Battle of Kasserine Pass, which actually increasingly pisses me off. I rewatched John Calhoun's show you did some time ago, just the other day, and he's, by the way, can't tell you how absolutely I agree with him. It infuriates me, and I've done this with colleagues locally. It absolutely infuriates me that people say, somehow think we lost the Battle of Kasserine Pass. We won the Battle of Kasserine Pass. By any rational standards, the Allied, and it was a coalition effort, won the Battle of Kasserine Pass. In the dark umber circles, you see the critical German objectives for that operation. They didn't get one of them. How can you say they won the Battle of Kasserine Pass? That said, if you then break that up into the difference between Kasserine Pass and the battles of the Eastern Dorsal, well, yes, the United States Army, especially the United States Army Tactical Command in place at the time, rather humiliated itself there. There's no doubt. And a lot of very good young Americans died, and that's tragic because nothing about that entire approach to the operation had anything to do with the tactical doctrine, artillery, infantry, or armor that had been worked out prior to the war. What the hell Fredendahl was thinking and how he convinced his subordinate commanders, I will never know. It's not my area of expertise. I'm not going there. I'm sure his mother loved him, but he's certainly on my high list for the worst corps commander of the U.S. in the war. If, however, we look at the battles in the Kasserine Pass, you will discover that we won those. The Germans were able to break into the Kasserine Pass, and what they found was they were in an artillery trap. And by this time, with U.S. artillery commanders having been allowed to do it by the book for once, reorganize on doctrinal lines, get everybody's artillery sorted back out the way it was intended to function, we shattered them and gave the 10th and the DAC a drubbing from which it never fully recovered. I think the real capabilities from the beginning of the U.S. field artillery shows best at the Battle of Thela, which is, by the way, a British command. This is based on the 26th.
Trevor, our resident Tunisia expert, predicted you were going to mention that. So there we are. There's wisdom in the sidebar.
You're a good man, Sheehan. The Nick Force. Brigadier General Nicholson builds on the back of the 26th British Armor Brigade, a task force. They fight a desperate series of delaying actions up the pass to Thela, but they are on the ropes and going down. On the 19th of, late on the 17th of February, the U.S. 9th Infantry Division is in billets trying to sort itself out in and around Iran. and the 9th Infantry Division Artillery is told that they need on less than 4 hours notice to get packed up alone. They're moving without the rest of the division to reinforce Tebessa, which was the biggest problem the U.S. thought they had at the time. And they'd also lost a lot of artillery in those engagements in the Eastern Dorsal. So again, rather undoctrinally, the 9th Division Artillery packs up on 4 hours notice. They actually are down one of their direct support battalions because it's simply not all off the ship yet. They do pick up two infantry cannon companies that happen to be nearby and take them with them, with their mini 105 guns. 800-mile road march to Tebessa over winter mountain roads. They do it in 48 hours, which is pretty amazing. Moving constantly. En route, the march column stretched over 19 miles. So it took like an hour to pass at about 20 miles an hour, which is about what they could manage. On the right, you get some idea of what those roads look like in winter and what they were dealing with. Kind of remarkably to me, they only lost 2 guns en route to bad road conditions. Unfortunately, they were both 155 general support howitzers, so they were down firepower. By the way, that's the battalion that Calhoun mentioned that was commanded by William Westmoreland, who will go on to either fame or infamy, depending on how you think about Vietnam.
Trevor predicted that as well.
Yeah. Okay. On the plus side, they lose 2 155s, but they picked up 31 refugee British guns from one unit or another on the way and just folded them into their column and brought them right back. And and formed them on no notice at all into kind of a provisional artillery brigade based on what they had. They arrived in Tebessa to be told immediately that, top up your tanks, grab whatever ammunition you need here, and get up to Thala because you belong to the British now. Okay, yes, sir. Done. They got up there in about 4.5 hours, late on the afternoon of the 20th, which turned out to be just-in-time delivery. Think about what they then had to do. Having arrived in near Thala, they have to then plug in with Brigadier General Nicholson. They have to get their British guys sorted into some kind of tactical order. They have to get their guns in place. They have to register their targets. They have to figure out how to do a common artillery plot, not just with the American guns, but with the British guns, with the infantry guns. And they get all of this, and they have to pull in some kind of network, communications network to pull all this together. And they do that in about 12 hours, which I find remarkable. Brigadier General Irwin, S. Leroy Irwin, he will later command the 5th ID, which, by the way, was the controlling unit for what I opened with, that engagement in Lorraine. Remarkably able man. He had one huge advantage, I thought, in my personal opinion. Nicholson himself was an old gunner, and he got it, and they liked each other immediately. Nicholson was obviously rather relieved to see reinforcements anyway, but on a personal level, they liked each other. Now, to give Nicholson his credit, Nicholson to his dying day was effusive in his praise and gave all the credit for the victory to the intervention of the U.S. artillery, probably more credit than they really deserved, because God knows his men fought like tigers too. Any rate, they pulled all that together in 12 hours, multinational force, capable of engaging a single target called in by a single FO. And that gave the 10th Armored Division a very, very bad day. The one thing that the Brits and the infantry guns couldn't do was time on targets, but there were 3 battalions of U.S. artillery that could, and that was enough.
Trevor added the detail that you probably don't know, Bud, is the British HQ was in the village brothel above the post office. So there you go. There's a
one-stop shopping. I like it. Tactical learning curves, broad strokes. What do we learn in North Africa? Well, first we learn to use doctrine. Don't split up your artillery into random penny packets to support random task forces without any regard to who can, mutual support, integrated fires, nothing like that. Learn to dig in your guns properly. They learned that at Fort Sill and then promptly didn't do it because no one made them. The guns need to be properly positioned. You need to think about where they go. You need to get them dug in. You need to get them covered, blah, blah, blah. We learned on the lower left-hand corner that, fire plans need to be integrated with a scheme of maneuver at the beginning of planning and not retrofitted as an afterthought. Artillerymen need to be there throughout. We learned to cooperate internationally, if not always with the Bonheim from this staged Life magazine photograph, at least to make a working relationship, however they felt about each other personally, which increasingly we did, with some failures here and there. And we began to learn to use the air spotters in a critical way. They would become more and more critical as the war progressed. And in fact, they had one huge advantage that we didn't foresee. The mere presence of an American or British artillery spotter plane was itself the single best deterrent to counter battery fire from the Axis, because their guns were reluctant to ever open up if they thought they'd be seen. Because if an artillery spotter caught their flashes, they knew they'd have counter battery fire on them in minutes, not days. Matters.
Yeah.
It took an already degraded German artillery system down another 2 notches. Learning curves can move pretty quickly. El Guitar, a month later, right? And throw out everything you learned from Patton. Although they do show some artillery firing in that movie. I'll give them some credit. But, the 1st Infantry Division Artillery, having been brought back up to some semblance of strength, properly deployed, properly employed, properly integrated, backed up finally by a coherent core defense net, artillery fire net from 2nd Corps, just shattered the 10th again, as if they needed to be shattered again, in less than a month at El Guitar, and they never even broke through the forward lines. Were the maneuver guys involved? Of course they were. You couldn't have held the line without the infantry. Were there flanking armor attacks that were more successful than they'd been at, say, Faid? Yes. But I don't think anybody can really deny that Guitar is a battle that was overwhelmingly won by the U.S. field artillery, because the statistics would demonstrate it was. And most of the German commanders said that's exactly what beat us. Every time we even tried to get together to form an attack, we were shattered. Anzio is another great example. And leaving aside all of the controversies surrounding Anzio, was it a good idea, blah, blah, blah. Should Lucas have been more aggressive, or was he set up to fail anyway? I think Lucas gets a raw deal, just like I think Orlando Ward did, but that's just a personal opinion, and it's not my point today. The point is that when you do wind up in a perimeter at Anzio, there is no doubt that it was artillery, both British and American, that kept it alive. Really interesting battle anyway, because it was one of the very few proper artillery duels that the U.S. ever got into with the German army, because the German, Kesselring brought quite a lot of artillery to bear. And for the most part, the Americans won that game. Artillery is notable because it also cemented the already wildly exaggerated performance of the German 88 as a general field artillery piece. Don't get me wrong, I'm not taking anything away from the 88 as an anti-aircraft gun or an anti-tank gun. It was excellent in both those roles. The truth is, even though every soldier that ever got nicked by a mortar shell thought he was hit by an 88, including my father, the reality is that as a general purpose artillery piece, it was mediocre at best. They used it a lot because they had it. By the way, two can play at that game. On the left is a US 90 millimeter and in an artillery support role. We could do that too. We could do it with our M10 tank destroyers. We could do it with our chemical mortars, and we did at Anzio. The other thing that was demonstrated at Anzio was the logistics learning curve. That's an LCT pulling into whatever little harbor. I don't even know the name of the harbor at Anzio. I guess it is Anzio. What's remarkable is if you look in the back of those trucks, you'll see all those little objects that look like grains of rice, probably at your resolution on your screen. Those are medium artillery shells. The photograph itself is indicative to me of the desperation with which this resupply is being undertaken, because that's not a good way to ship artillery shells. I mean, you don't normally do that. So something pretty hairy is going on, but we always managed to keep just enough artillery throughput into Anzio to keep it alive. And it was, again, by the admission of all of the commanders involved, it was the artillery, British and American, more than any other factor that broke up the German attacks in an attempt to drive us back into the sea. Anybody want to dispute that on the sidebar? I'm ready. Okay. The logistics learning curve I just mentioned. Yeah, I blew up this ceremonial photograph taken by some unit probably fairly late in the war. Can you read what's on that, the inscription on that 105 shell? This is the 300,000th round that either that gun or more probably that battery had fired. 300. Doing the math, and all of the things being equal, that also means that that individual artillery tube on that carriage had probably been replaced at minimum of 6 times by the time they got around to firing this shell. That's the volume of artillery fire the U.S. had learned to rely on. And the U.S. logistics system, in all of its varied complexity, had learned to cope with successfully. A subject near and dear to your heart, Operation Luttich, the Battle of Mortain. You know, Rob, the history guy, whatever you call it, the history explorer, did a really nice piece on this some years ago. I don't want to take anything away from him, so I'm just going to kind of strut by this in passing. But, you know, everybody knows this Operation Luttich. The Panzer Corps recently just almost on an emergency basis redeployed from the Eastern Front to try to do a counterattack to recapture Avranches and cut off the Third Army and save Brittany, blah, blah, blah. The 220th, the second rather of the 120th and the 30th Division, basically refugees up onto Hill 314. Very fortuitous choice, even though it wasn't probably made with conscious thought. It just happened to be there. With them, they brought 2 forward observation parties, or they ended up with 2 forward observation parties. You know, one under then Second Lieutenant Rob Weiss, and one under, and this shows you how the attrition rate in forward observation parties, then Private Denius. He'll later be a sergeant, and by the way, got 4 Silver Stars in the war, which is impressive even by my standard. For those 6.5 desperate days that the second of the 120th is hanging on by their fingernails to Hill 314, by far, the most important weapons they had on that hill were binoculars, a map, a compass, and a radio. Because with those, they could rain hell on everything that came after them. Bottom 2 pictures, what do you know these well? These are views from the observation tower or platform at Montjoie, is how you say it. I'll call your attention to the left. Kind of depends on how big your screen is, but if you look along the horizon line, this is looking just slightly southwest.
Yep.
West-southwest. That little triangular gray blob right in the center on the horizon line, that's
Mont Saint-Michel.
Thank you, Mont Saint-Michel, which is what? You know better than I, 35?
Oh, it's like 25 miles away from there. Yeah, no, it's, yeah.
I mean, the views these guys had, the command of the terrain they had from up there was staggeringly good. And both of them were very competent forward observers. And thank God they were, because they could not only draw on the very formidable firepower of the 30th Division alone, but the firepower of every gun 8th Corps could muster, beg, borrow, and steal. And they used it very well. Between them in those 6.5 days, they called in over 300 fire missions. At some periods, they had 5 and 6 fire missions going simultaneously, and kudos to them just to keep that sorted out in their own heads. But they devastated the 2nd Panzer Division and elements of the 1st Panzer Division and the other Panzer Division, admittedly not at full strength. But, you know, here's some of, well, you can see that's the, Abbeville, the Mortain train station and the background of that photograph.
Nuremberg. Yeah, Nuremberg.
Right,
yeah.
right. Any rate, you get an idea. You know, they not only kept their own battalion alive by calling sheets of fire to interrupt any attempt of the Germans to come up and take that hill, but then for miles around, they could command the roads, and shattered that ability of Operation Luttich, which may have been kind of a Hail Mary in the first place, to succeed.
Yeah. And just to add that, I always add the fact that when the RAF went in to survey all the wreckage on the ground after battle to prove how effective the Typhoons, everything were, even the RAF, who had a vested interest in making their part roll and it seemed good, they concluded 84% of the vehicles knocked out were by artillery.
Well, thank you. I didn't actually know that fact. See, I learned something every day too.
Well, we all do, you know. And you can. I've got the RAF report at home. I'll send it to you. Remind me, I've got it somewhere. You can sense the bitterness of this RAF guide. And yes, although it's typed, you can read the tone of voice. Yes, from our estimations, it seems that the artillery.
But I do admire his intellectual integrity.
Yeah.
By the way, I think the same can kind of be said of the Falaise Gap, but
absolutely, artillery. You read the accounts of the German generals who got out there. It's artillery they talk about, not the German soldiers talk about the Yabos, but the generals that come up, they talk about artillery. That's right. What they're worried about. But yeah, rabbit hole.
So guys, kind of moving towards the late war here, but you know, the Bulge and artillery probably showed at its apex in the Bulge. Particularly in saving shattered units, you know, surprise attacks, et cetera, et cetera. I'm going to concentrate on 2 specific issues, and I'm going to do them very superficially, so don't get me wrong. You know, go on one of Woody's outstanding tours if you want to go into depth on this stuff, because he does a better job than I could. But Elsenborn Ridge, you know, the remnants, the remnants of 2 completely broken U.S. divisions, and then 2 badly degraded divisions sort of pitch up on Elsenborn Ridge. And what keeps them alive and what absolutely shatters the entire ability of the 1st SS Panzer Corps to get anywhere near its objectives is this rain of fire that can be called down. And again, you're going to find numbers vary. The official Army Green Books say there were 27 battalions of U.S. artillery involved in the defense of Elsenborn Ridge. But I've read other sources that say that number is closer to 35, 36. The reality is that unless somebody's got the wherewithal, and I don't, to try to drag through every official report from every battalion that survives, you're probably never going to really know. But it was a staggering volume of artillery that got sorted out by extraordinarily competent, albeit exhausted, and in many cases wounded, American artillerymen that simply held that northern shoulder of the Bulge, and that was everything. You know, you get one shoulder, now you get the other, and then comes a Leavenworth textbook exercise in how you destroy a penetration. What contributed that was new? Well, guess what finally got turned loose? The VT fuse, or, you know, I'll come back to that in a minute, but just for those who don't appreciate the significance of what this meant, upper picture is a ground burst. The lower picture is an air burst. Can you see how much more coverage on the ground that air burst creates? I mean, there's no comparison. We'd known that since before the First World War. We had time fuses. The problem with time fuses is after about 6,000 yards, it gets really, really difficult to compute a time for detonation for all the reasons we discussed in that boring whole center tech section. Generally speaking, to get effective airbursts, you need to adjust them like you would a ground burst, except you're adjusting the height at which this stuff's going off, and it doesn't give you a lot of time to do it. The Germans were notoriously bad at ever affecting airbursts, which is why they did two things. It's one, why they kind of invented ricochet fire. We played around with it for a while ourselves based on experiencing in North Africa and decided we can do better. The other reason, and you see this in the Bulge, in Band of Brothers even, why was the German barrages on Easy Company in that movie so effective? Because they were hitting trees.
Tree burst.
Hitting air bursts, which they couldn't have done with their timed fuses because they just didn't have the observers to do it. Guess what a proc does it for you? By the way, this is there's a really good Wikipedia article on this. I encourage anybody that's really interested in the technicalities to read it. It's a very complicated story, but this is a monument to the cooperative, productive relationship the U.S. and the British had in the Second World War for all the political noise and friction. It's a British concept. Most of the technical details are worked by them, but it is finished and ultimately produced in numbers by the U.S. electronics research industries. Incredibly cooperative. Nobody played games about who got credit. Actually fielded in 1943, but because we were so desperately afraid the Germans would capture it, capture copies and retrofit them, they were not allowed to be fired in ground warfare. They were restricted to anti-aircraft use. By the way, totally separate sidebar, but there are Admiral Kincaid, for example, credited our surviving the kamikaze attacks off Iwo Jima overwhelmingly to the fact that we had VT fuses. And it at least, in his estimation, it at least quintupled the effectiveness of anti-aircraft fire. Did the same thing for ground warfare. It just broke them up. Swinging wildly to the other side of the Bulge, to the southern side, the 101st at Bastogne. God bless those boys. I mean, seriously. But given another example of intellectual integrity, after the war, McAuliffe, at the 500th dinner celebrating his nuts moment at Bastogne. Remember, McAuliffe was the division artillery commander.
Yeah.
Significant. Said, I've not taken anything away from my division, who are the best unit in the army, but I basically had the scratch equivalent of a corps in Bastogne, and especially in artillery. On the bottom there, I've got, he had the full 100. He had the presence of mind when they were alerted to make sure that artillery got priority, so they had extra ammunition. But an airborne artillery division or airborne division's artillery, as useful and necessary and critical as it is by no means formidable. 75 millimeter guns backed up by a couple of batteries of short 105s. What kept them, by McAuliffe's own admission, alive in Bastogne was he also had 2 battalions of M7s, upper left-hand corner, from the 10th Armored Division's CCBA.
Yeah.
And he had another 2 battalions of M2 155 medium howitzers. Was it the 6th Division? At any rate, they were strays from somewhere that he scooped up. And that firepower that he had concentrated in Bastogne is what broke up every German attack that made that desperately thin perimeter's ability to hold possible.
101st Airborne veterans of Bastogne would kind of punch me on the arm when I reminded them of the artillery support they got from 10th Armored and go, well, yeah, kind of, yeah. Begrudgingly accept, yes. But yeah, a big part of the story.
I bet they didn't say that on December 23rd, but okay.
No. But yeah.
All right. Well, it also helped that, again, McAuliffe was an artilleryman because he organized that scratch group extraordinarily well, down to and including taking a couple of battalion commanders he thought was screwing up and just said, "You're fired. Major, this is your battalion, but I'm going to tell you how to run it." I mean, that was a happy accident that it was McAuliffe in command there. Not taking anything away from Maxwell Taylor. I actually quite admire him in many ways, but McAuliffe was the right man for that job.
Oh, I agree. I agree for not just McAuliffe being good. I think Taylor was suffering from his mental health wasn't quite in the right place, I think, in December.
That's quite possible.
But yeah, when that rabbit hole, we're not going to go down. But yeah, back to you.
Old missions, new tricks, direct fire, Napoleonic stuff. But it was still important. It was important. It was important at Gila. It was important at Salerno. It kept coming up throughout the war. It really came into high relief when we ran up on the Siegfried line because of how well prepared and well constructed those German defenses were. And so actually the M12 picked up a new nickname, largely as a result of that, the Siegfried door knocker. You could just roll up. You guys won't come out and you won't surrender. Then guess what? We'll huff and we'll puff and we'll blow your door in. And we did over and over and over again. And again, everybody was very happy to do this. They had to invent kind of a new tactical procedure. You had to have enough small arms firepower to suppress the ability of their anti-tank guns and whatever else they had in there to shoot back at you, while basically the door knocker opened the way. The Pacific. I'm going to go through this in a New York minute. The guns were in the Pacific. They mattered in the Pacific. Because of the nature of Pacific fighting, for the vast majority of the war, there were many, many fewer separate battalions, core artillery battalions, largely because there just wasn't room to deploy them. I mean, Europe did have priority, but even if they had deployed them, where were you going to put them on Tarawa? You weren't going to do it. So, but divisional artillery and regimental artillery was there from the very beginning on the left to the very end on the right. There were some variations based on the unique terrain, climate factors. The M3 pack howitzer, the M1 pack howitzer, the 75, was an extraordinarily popular gun in the Pacific because it was handy. You could get it through these Pacific jungles, these mountains, blah, blah, blah. And the Japanese didn't have much that was much bigger, so it was an adequate gun for that purpose. On the right, high-angle missions ran about 2-to-1 in the Pacific, which is about the inverse of what they were in Europe. Again, because of just the terrain factors. You have to get a high-angle howitzer that can lob that shell up and bring it right back down on a reverse slope where you need it. So that was very popular. And particularly later in the campaigns, New Guinea, New Guinea was not later, but, especially when you get to the bigger engagements, there was latitude for the heavy guns too, particularly given the Japanese adroitness at creating really formidable field fortifications. So the big guns played their role. At the end of the war, the biggest guns played a major role. The siege of Manila, when basically that was an artillery street fight. It was tank and artillery fire that kind of blasted building by building right through Manila, until the Japanese garrison surviving garrison was driven back in the Intramuros citadel, the 16th century or whatever, 17th century defensive structure, which they had refortified. And it was even, the heaviest gun in the U.S. arsenal, the 240 howitzer that knocked down the walls. And there's actually a photograph of it there in the center, knocked down the walls that made it possible for the 148th Infantry Regimental Combat Team to break through and clean that up. Otherwise, they could have held out for a vastly longer period of time. Now, we did knock down 3/4 of Manila in the process, and that's tragic, but it was effective. I'm getting to the end here for those of you who desperately need a bladder break.
Yeah. Good stuff. That is. Yeah. Good quote.
I love that quote. There you go. That's my opinion. The U.S. Army was the A-team, not taking a thing away from the courage, the capability, the commitment, the professionalism of the other branches, but artillery got it right first and got it right the most. And they were indispensable in helping us win the war at the cost we actually paid. Otherwise, I think it would have been a far, far bloodier affair.
Brilliant stuff.
Well, good, because I'm rounds complete, as we say at the end of a fire mission, and ready for your abuse.
Okay, well, a lot of the questions you kind of addressed as we went along, but there's a couple I want to bring up. Stephen asked very early on, can you please explain about the compensating for the gun recoil effect? I always see this in the films of World War II. So, you know, when a gun rolls back, you know, and forward again, how does that get compensated for?
Well, a modern gun has it built in, and I'm going to reach behind me for a model. Okay. So what you've got is you've got a recoil system that's based on these springs on the side. If they're clear at all, they keep the gun level. They compensate for the weight. They allow you to push it up and down with relatively small motions, but everything else is a hydropneumatic recoil system, so that when the gun fires, boom, that compresses that compresses various fluids. We call them recoil juice, whatever. And then the gun immediately goes back into battery. This was the great magic of the French 75 in the 1890s that nobody else had been able to do. So my point is that you don't really have to compensate for it. The gunner will check his sight every time after each round just to make sure he's still on. But if the gun is properly in place and it's properly functioning, it should come right back into battery and be ready to reload without any fooling around. Now, can't always accomplish that. Sometimes you're going to, pardon me for turning my back. Sometimes you're going to, you know, it's going to shift under you. The ground's going to be unstable. At which point, what you do is gunner just looks at his sight, gets back on his aiming stakes. Usually only takes a few seconds. The catastrophic problems you have is if, you know, the recoil system actually breaks, at which point that gun's just out of action. And you hope that you didn't kill anybody when it happened. I've seen this even in training where a gun disassociated itself from its recoil system and cut one of the loaders in half. It was a pretty grim night. But it happens. But it doesn't happen often. We made good stuff.
This is a comment from British muzzle loaders. Funny that each of the allies will anecdotally tout their system as superior, faster, more flexible. Great hearing from an American point of view. So that was a compliment earlier on. And Craig added, one officer described the US Army as a field force optimized to deliver artillery fire, which is not far off reality. So that's the representative comments coming in there. We had a couple of comments from World War II analyzed earlier about the fact that the US are producing shells for the artillery. You know, he talked about the fact they only allocated 3% of for the D-Day invasion, whereas the Germans allowed 25%. So, and that the Germans outproduced the Americans in 1944 in artillery shell production. Was a lack of ammo an issue until 45 to some extent?
No. Well, you know what? I've never heard that allegation. I will have to look into that. I'm not going to pretend to a knowledge I don't have. I will tell you that Russell Weigley, in his book, Eisenhower's Lieutenants, made much of the shell shortages in 44, particularly in Lorraine. I have a tremendous respect for Dr. Weigley, but I disagree with him there. I've never seen evidence that it was a major problem. There were, you know, the biggest problem was coming over the beach with it. There was a lot of artillery taken away from 3rd Army and reallocated to 21st Army Group for whatever reason. Led to another example, I think, of American professional excellence. Patton was not a man easily deterred, neither were his artillery commanders. For the renewed Lorraine campaign, to conserve U.S. Army artillery ammunition, that entire preparatory 2-day fire was done with captured German equipment and ammunition. So I've got some pictures I decided not to include in this of Americans firing, you know, FH-18s, 170 howitzers, even 88s. We fired that entire prep with captured ammunition. Were there shortages? There's, local shortages are inevitable. Did it ever become operationally critical? I'm not aware that it did. I'm willing to be corrected.
Yeah, well, I mean, he said he'd send you some documents.
Okay,
and he's got an EDO study
I
that
would
says
appreciate that sincerely.
most major items of artillery ammunition were in short supply on the continent from June 1944 to April 1945. So I'll put you two in touch earlier. One last question, otherwise we'll be here for the rest of the day, and it's from British muzzle loaders again, saying, "Oh no, that's not the one." How would the use and speed of Mike, Uncle, etc. targets compare to US practices? It's always the size and speed that are talked about. So that's comparing the British and American systems.
Yeah. It depends on the priority that was given to that target. The British remained better at pre-planning targets than the Americans were because the Americans didn't have to be. In fact, I've even got a statistic to I think that somewhat validates that. For Operation Cobra, 8th Corps fired in the 3 days of the major Cobra breakthrough, fired 82 planned targets as against 632 unplanned targets. In fact, they opened the night of Cobra with 30 simultaneous TOTs on known German.
You're going to have to send me that information because that's what I'm writing about right now. And the speed 8th Corps moving, I'm surprised they had any predetermined stuff because it's all they're moving off the maps before they can issue the maps to some extent. Very different to the previous 6 weeks of the Normandy campaign.
No, I agree with you. But the answer to the question is the British compensated, and I have enormous. Like I said, I would. If the U.S. was here in artillery, the British were right here. The Germans are down here. And
I think that you end up getting into the sort of tradition and culture and doctrine as well. It's like when people ask me which is the best rifle, the American M1 or the British Lee Enfield number 4, I say, well, it depends on how you've been training to use it. The British tend to have this kind of one shot, one kill mentality, with fewer rounds to use in training, fewer rounds to have in practice. So the M1 is the best for the Americans, and the number 4 is the best for the British and Canadians. So sometimes I think that although, as you've explained, the British and US systems have a common lineage, but they have slightly different systems. So it's a bit apples and oranges anyway.
Right. But just to specifically answer his Mike Uncle question, what the British did, again, in compensation, was they would stay, a proportion of their guns would stay laid on these pre-planned priority concentrations. That allowed them to react to a target at those concentrations as fast or even faster than the Americans.
Yeah.
The problem for the British would come if that concentration wasn't what we needed and you had to move there. It would take them longer than the Americans to do the same thing. That's the real difference.
Yeah. No, we're going to, and just the last comment is going to Dr. Phil Blood over there in Aachen. The Field Artillery Detachments, Integrated Infantry Battalions at Aachen made a huge difference. This talk helps explain a lot of that story. And he paid you a compliment earlier on about one of the best shows on channel. And Dr. Phil is a tough audience to impress, because he's a cynical, grumpy old man. And he wouldn't mind me saying that because I'm a cynical, grumpy old man and we're mates. But we will leave it. I think it's worth considering inviting you back to do an artillery question and answer. Just come on and answer stuff. Maybe even get Rob, History Explorer, involved from the British point of view, and the two of you could act and field questions. I was talking to Rob this morning, so we'll try.
I would absolutely love that. I will clear my calendar for you, my friend.
I'll try and find an Aussie or New Zealander artillery guy as well to join in. We can really get in there. But anyway, folks, I'm back again tomorrow. We're off to Leyte Gulf. On nearly the anniversary of the battle there, with Tony talking about that. And then on Friday we're off to Breslau or Wrocław in Poland for the 1945 campaign with the incredible Richard Hargreaves. As always, click like and subscribe. Buy my guest books, read their blogs, look at their paperwork, etc., etc., etc. But I will see you all again tomorrow. It's been fantastic talking to you, Bud. Brilliant stuff. Cheers. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.